It began on a Thursday afternoon, one of those gently overcast summer days when the sky threatens rain but never quite delivers. In the quiet village of Netherdene, the Reverend and Mrs. Clement were hosting their annual garden party, an event that signalled the true beginning of the social season, such as it was in a place as modest as Netherdene. The bunting was strung, the tea urns were steaming, and the vicarage garden was filled with the chittering hum of local chatter, clinking china, and the occasional complaint about the shortage of sausage rolls. Miss Jane Marple, recently returned from a fortnight's visit to her nephew Raymond's house in London, sat comfortably beneath a striped parasol. Her blue eyes twinkled behind delicate spectacles as she sipped her tea and made quiet conversation with Mrs. Bantry, the Colonel's widow. It was, as she had remarked to her housekeeper earlier that morning, just the sort of occasion where something unexpected might happen, though one always hopes it doesn't. She meant it too. In her experience, cheerful village gatherings had a curious knack for unearthing long-buried tensions. Still, she didn't expect trouble today. Newcomer, perhaps, a bit of romantic gossip, a small family quarrel. That was the extent of it. And then he arrived. It was some time after the second round of cucumber sandwiches when a tall, broad-shouldered man stepped through the garden gate. He was smartly dressed with an air of self-assurance that was just a touch too polished for a place like Netherdene. He wore a light grey suit, the sort that creased elegantly, and a hat tilted at a confident angle. His face was deeply tanned, as though he had come from abroad, and there was something distinctly American in the looseness of his stride. "Good Lord," said Mrs. Bantry, peering over her teacup. "Who is that?" Miss Marple turned her head, slightly but didn't speak. She watched as heads began to turn, whispers started, and chairs were subtly adjusted to face the intruder. He greeted no one at first, merely took a slow look round the garden with an expression that could be interpreted as fondness or calculation. Then he smiled, lifted his hat to no one in particular, and made his way toward the refreshment table. Mrs. Clement, clearly uncertain of her duties in the face of such boldness, stepped forward with an awkward, churchly smile. "I don't believe we've met," she said. "Are you new to the village?" "No," said the man with a slow smile. "I lived here once, long time ago." He glanced around again. "I imagine I look a bit different now." A silence fell around him, soft but perceptible. Conversations quieted, people stared more openly, and then someone gasped, "Arthur!" All eyes turned to Miss Penelope Grey, a retired schoolmistress known for her fastidiousness and deep dislike of dramatics. She stood frozen, her teacup trembling in her hand. "It can't be," she whispered. "It's been 30 years. The man nodded. "That's right. Arthur Bridgman, returned from the dead, as it were." A pause. "I thought you drowned," she said faintly. Several people now stared. Someone dropped a scone. "Well," he said, "calm as you please. You thought wrong." Miss Marple lowered her cup and leaned forward slightly in her chair. Her face remained serene, but inside her mind had already begun arranging pieces, quietly setting aside the sausage rolls and jam tarts of the present to examine the long-forgotten gossip of the past. Because Arthur Bridgman, if that's who this man truly was, had once been at the centre of a very old scandal in Netherdene. A theft, a disappearance, and whispers of betrayal that were never quite settled. And now here he stood, casually folding his napkin and reaching for a jam tart. The clouds overhead darkened slightly, casting a brief shadow over the vicarage lawn. The first drop of rain fell unnoticed. 5 days later, Arthur Bridgman would be found dead in the orchard behind the old schoolhouse. And it would fall to Miss Marple, quietly knitting at her window, to remember not just who he was, but why. Everyone else had tried so hard to forget. Miss Marple did not speak of Arthur Bridgman's return that evening, though the village hummed with it like bees stirred from a hive. Gossip moved quickly in Netherdene, swifter than the post, and far more creatively delivered. By the time Miss Marple placed her embroidery back in its basket and stirred her nightly cup of cocoa, she had already overheard 3 contradictory accounts of Arthur's disappearance 30 years ago, none of them wholly accurate. The facts, as far as Miss Marple remembered them, and she remembered quite a lot, were as follows. Arthur Bridgman had been a bright, ambitious young man, the son of the village's late schoolmaster. He'd worked in the post office before leaving rather suddenly. That much was certain. Rumours at the time hinted at a minor scandal involving missing money, but no charges were ever brought, and Arthur had vanished before anyone could make a proper fuss. Some said he'd gone abroad, others believed he'd drowned during an attempt to flee, and now, as though summoned by the passage of years or the weight of guilt, he had reappeared, greyer, broader, still charming, and evidently very much alive. The next morning, as if to underline the man's return as a fixture rather than a fluke, Arthur strolled into the village shop, just as Mrs. Durrant was purchasing her weekly eggs. By afternoon, he had taken up residence at the Red Pheasant, the local inn, and was seen greeting old acquaintances with a polished ease that suggested either selective memory or selective conscience. To Miss Marple's observing eye, something about him rang hollow, not his identity necessarily, but his cheer. She watched from her front window as he passed by on the second morning, doffing his hat to young Emily Sharp, who worked part-time at the bakery. He greeted her with the same warm charm he'd used on Mrs. Clement, and the same he had used, Miss Marple noted, on Penelope Grey at the garden party. There was something too even in his affections. He had the air of a man who needed to be liked, but not necessarily remembered too well. By the third day, Arthur had become a topic not just of gossip, but of open speculation. He made his presence known in all the usual places, the pub, the churchyard, even a brief and theatrical pause in front of the old schoolhouse. He'd been seen talking animatedly with Gerald Huxley, the solicitor, and again with Basil Reed, the town clerk. And though he often said he had no intention of staying long, he never quite seemed to say why he had returned at all. That question hung over the village like the clouds that hadn't lifted since the party. Mrs. Bantry, who always fancied herself slightly more worldly than the rest of the villagers, declared that Arthur was clearly after some inheritance. Why else come back here after 30 years? It's not sentiment. No one's that fond of Nether Dean. Miss Marple, who had long since learned to trust the patterns of people rather than their words, said nothing. It was on the 5th evening, the very evening before the tragedy, that something shifted. Miss Marple was walking home from the post office when she spotted Arthur standing in the shadow of the old oak at the edge of the church path. He was alone, but tense, shoulders drawn inward like a man trying to shrink from something inevitable. He did not see her. She paused just long enough to see him take something from his coat pocket, a slip of paper perhaps, and study it for a long moment before tearing it cleanly down the middle and letting the halves drift to the ground. She made a mental note of the act, not because it was inherently suspicious, but because it was so dramatically done. Men who tear up papers in such a fashion are rarely free of secrets. It was theatrical and a little desperate. That night it rained. A quiet, consistent drizzle that cloaked the village in grey and washed the leaves clean of summer dust. Miss Marple, who had taken to her knitting early, sat in the drawing-room and listened to the tap-tap of rain against the windows. It was a soothing sound, and she had nearly dozed off when she was jolted by a knock at the door. It was young Constable. Phipps, his helmet slightly askew and his face pale. He removed it the moment she opened the door. "Miss Marple, I'm sorry to trouble you. The inspector said you ought to be told." He hesitated. "It's Arthur Bridgman. He's dead." She blinked. "Dead?" "In the orchard behind the old schoolhouse. We found him not more than an hour ago." There was a long pause. "Murdered?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady. "We don't know yet. Could have been a fall, but—" He faltered. "Well, Inspector Craddock says it doesn't look natural." Miss Marple stood quite still, her hands folded before her. "Who found him?" "Miss Penelope Grey. She was walking her spaniel just before dusk. She said she thought he looked asleep at first." "How very strange," Miss Marple murmured. "I imagine the inspector will be calling on me in due course." Phipps nodded. "Yes, ma'am." She thanked him and closed the door with a soft click. It was not until the next morning that the fuller picture emerged. Arthur Bridgman had indeed been found in the orchard, slumped against a tree as though he had merely sat down to rest. But his expression, as described by Inspector Craddock later that day, was one of surprise and pain. A post-mortem was already being arranged, though Craddock admitted privately to Miss Marple that there had been no visible wounds, no head injuries, no blood. "No signs of a struggle," he said. "But the look on his face, Miss Marple, it wasn't peaceful." Miss Marple nodded. "I dare say not. Some poisons are like that." Craddock raised an eyebrow. "You think it was poison?" "I think," said Miss Marple softly, "that Arthur Bridgman returned to Netherdean not to revisit the past, but to confront it, and someone else wasn't ready for that." Craddock frowned. He was speaking to a good many people. Penelope Grey, Gerald, Huxley, Basil Reed, and Mrs. Durrant says she saw him in the post office 3 times this week. "Indeed," said Miss Marple. "And perhaps the most interesting question is not who he spoke to, but who he avoided." Craddock sighed. "That's always the difficulty. In a village like this, everyone has a history. Everyone has secrets." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes, but not everyone is good at hiding them." Craddock tapped his notebook. "We'll need to talk to everyone again, thoroughly." "Of course," said Miss Marple, rising. "But I'd suggest you speak first to Miss Grey. It's not often one finds a former school teacher fainting at the sight of a corpse, especially not one they recognize so quickly after 30 years. Craddock tilted his head. "You think she knew more than she let on at the garden party?" "I think," Miss Marple said, "that some people try to forget the past. Others try to rewrite it. But the truth, well, the truth always has a curious way of reappearing. Rather like Arthur Bridgman." And with that she turned back toward her window, the rain slowing to a gentle mist outside, and the village once again holding its breath. The following morning brought a peculiar quiet over Netherdean, the kind of silence that settles not from peace, but from collective anticipation. Every curtain was half drawn, every conversation spoken just under the breath. The death of Arthur Bridgman had unsettled the village more deeply than any outward mourning betrayed. It was not grief that gripped them, but uncertainty. No one quite knew what to say or whom to trust. Miss Marple, after her customary breakfast of lightly boiled egg and toast, took a slow stroll toward the green. She observed the hesitant nods, the way villagers stopped mid-sentence as she passed, and how Miss Penelope Grey's front curtains remained conspicuously closed, despite it being well past 9. That, to Miss Marple, was quite telling. As she passed the grocer's, she was intercepted by Mrs. Bantry, who wasted no time in drawing her aside. "Jane, you've heard by now, of course. Awful business," she whispered, as though Arthur's ghost might be hiding behind the potatoes. "Yes," Miss Marple replied with the calmness that unsettled others more than alarm. "I understand Inspector Craddock is continuing his inquiries this morning." Mrs. Bantry leaned in. "Well, if you ask me, it's all rather too convenient. He comes back after decades, and not a week later he's found dead in the very orchard where the old school plays were held. Don't you find that dramatic?" "I find it pointed," Miss Marple said mildly, "though the orchard is quiet and out of view, a sensible place if someone wished not to be seen." "Oh," Mrs. Bantry blinked. "Yes, I hadn't thought of that." At that moment, Gerald Huxley emerged from the post office. He was typically brisk and well-groomed, but today his coat was slightly askew, and he had forgotten his usual umbrella, despite the persistent damp. Miss Marple, observing as always, offered him a gentle smile. "Mr. Huxley, you must be very busy these days." He gave a tight nod. Yes, very. It's all a bit sudden, isn't it? I hadn't seen Arthur Bridgman since we were boys, and then he turns up just like that. You spoke to him, didn't you?" "I did, yes, briefly, on Tuesday. He said he was sorting out some old paperwork, might need a solicitor. But it was vague. No mention of a will or anything. I don't even think he owned property here." Miss Marple inclined her head. "But perhaps he hoped to claim something." Gerald blinked at her. "Do you think that's what he was about?" "I think," Miss Marple said gently, "that most people return home because they either left something behind or never truly left at all." Gerald nodded, though his mind was plainly elsewhere. As he moved off, Miss Marple continued her walk, eventually turning down the lane that led toward Miss Grey's cottage. A visit, she decided, was overdue. Penelope answered the door after several moments, her complexion pale and her expression wary. She wore a cardigan buttoned too high for the weather and seemed surprised, but not displeased to see Miss Marple. "Miss Marple?" Well, come in if you like." The sitting room was tidy but airless, the sort of place where emotions had long since been pressed under layers of routine. Miss Marple accepted a seat and a cup of tea, noting the tremble in the woman's hands as she poured. "I won't stay long," she began, her voice warm. "I just wanted to be sure you were quite all right. It must have been a shock." Penelope nodded slowly. "It was. I didn't recognize him at first, not really. And then I did." "It's a curious thing," Miss Marple said, stirring her tea. "Memory. It conceals and reveals in unequal measure." Penelope did not respond immediately. Her gaze was fixed on the teacup, as though it held the safety of a script. Then, "I hadn't thought of Arthur in years, and then suddenly there he was. And I was a girl again. You knew him well. Once." A pause. "Before he left, he was kind to me, when the others weren't." Miss Marple waited. "I always wondered why he disappeared," Penelope went on. "There were whispers, of course, but he never wrote, never explained. And now he's dead, and I don't know what to think." Miss Marple, ever the listener, asked, "And when you saw him at the garden party?" "I wasn't sure it was him until later," Penelope said quickly. "I thought it might be, but I doubted myself. And when he spoke to me, he acted as though nothing had changed, as though we were still children, as though he hadn't vanished. And yet, I believe he asked to meet with you again," Miss Marple said delicately. Penelope froze. "Who told you that?" Miss Marple merely smiled. "No one. But it seems likely. He sought out Gerald Huxley. He spent time with Basil Reed. I imagine he wanted to speak to those who remembered him, or who remembered what happened." Penelope's eyes narrowed. "I don't know what he wanted. He asked to meet me for tea, yes, yesterday, but I declined. Why? I didn't want to reopen the past. I thought it better left buried." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "Yet, the past has a way of uncovering itself, Miss Grey, whether we wish it or not." She left shortly thereafter, taking her time walking home through the wet air, which now carried a faint chill. Something about Penelope's nervousness did not align with mere surprise. There was guilt there, not necessarily of the crime, but of omission. And that could be just as dangerous. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple found a note from Inspector Craddock slipped under her door. "Jane. Post-mortem confirms poisoning. No signs of ingestion. Looks to be injected. Quiet inquiry proceeding. Let's speak tomorrow. See." She folded the note thoughtfully. Injected poison. That eliminated the possibility of accidental death entirely and pointed to a deliberate, methodical killer. one who had not only motive and opportunity, but knowledge. The sort of knowledge not common in a village like Netherdean, unless one knew where to look. She returned to her embroidery, but found her fingers moving slowly. Her thoughts turned to Basil Reed, a man whose mild manners belied an aggressive ambition. He had been seen arguing with Arthur near the pub 2 nights before the death. According to Mrs. Sims, who ran the place, it had been over money, or property, something about the ownership of the schoolhouse plot. Arthur, it seemed, had hinted at wanting to reclaim it. Then there was the torn paper in the orchard. She would have to revisit the spot herself, not merely rely on the reports of others. Perhaps something still lingered there. A scrap overlooked, a thread out of place. The light had begun to fade again when she finally stepped back out into the lane. The orchard lay quiet, its branches heavy with damp. She found the tree easily. The bark still bore the faint impression of where Arthur had sat, and beneath the grass, after several minutes of searching with a gloved hand, she found it, the 2 halves of a page, damp but still legible. It was not a letter. It was a map, a rough sketch of the village centered on the schoolhouse. And beneath the drawing, 2 words, hidden truth. Miss Marple stood slowly, her gaze sweeping across the orchard to the crumbling edges of the old school. She knew now, beyond doubt, that Arthur Bridgman had come back not to claim something but to expose something, and someone had made very sure he never would. As she turned to leave, a soft creak sounded behind her. The orchard was empty, or so it appeared. But Miss Marple had spent her life noticing the things others missed. She did not pause. She merely walked on as though she had found nothing at all. The following day dawned grey and misty, with a damp chill settling over Netherdean that seemed to mirror the sombre mood of its inhabitants. Miss Marple rose early, her thoughts still lingering on the torn map she had found in the orchard. The cryptic phrase, hidden truth, had unsettled her deeply. It was clear now that Arthur Bridgman's return was far from casual nostalgia. He had come back with purpose, and it was a purpose someone was desperate to conceal. After a simple breakfast, Miss Marple set out once more toward the village schoolhouse. The old building stood at the edge of town, its brick walls worn and covered in creeping ivy. The school had closed years ago, yet it remained a gathering point for village meetings and the occasional community event. What, she wondered, could Arthur have meant by hidden truth connected to this place? As she approached, she noticed a small crowd gathered near the front gate. Among them were familiar faces. Basil Reed, looking tense and restless, Gerald Huxley, who seemed ill at ease, and several others whispering behind cupped hands. Inspector Craddock was there as well, his dark eyes scanning the area with a mix of official authority and curiosity. Miss Marple greeted the inspector quietly. "Good morning, Inspector." "I imagine this place holds more secrets than its walls suggest." Craddock nodded. "You could say that. We received reports last night of some disturbance here. Someone tried to break in." "Indeed." Miss Marple's voice was soft but firm. "Yes, a broken window, nothing stolen. We suspect someone was searching for something, perhaps the same hidden truth Mr. Bridgman was after." Miss Marple's gaze shifted to Basil Reed, who stood with his hands clenched at his sides. The tension radiating from him was unmistakable. When their eyes met, Basil gave a brief nod, as though acknowledging an unspoken challenge. "May I?" Miss Marple gestured toward the schoolyard. Craddock stepped aside, and she moved cautiously past the gate, noting the shards of glass scattered on the ground. The door to the headmaster's office was ajar, and inside, the dusty shelves were disturbed. Papers lay scattered, some torn, others folded with care. Miss Marple carefully picked up a folded sheet from the floor. It was a letter, yellowed with age, addressed to a certain Eleanor Bridgman, Arthur's mother. The letter spoke of a dispute over a parcel of land adjoining the schoolhouse and hinted at a scandal involving the local council. The ink was faded, but the accusation was clear. Someone had manipulated council decisions for personal gain, leaving the Bridgman family out in the cold. Outside, voices rose in argument. Miss Marple stepped back into the sunlight, where Basil and Gerald were now confronting one another. "It's true," Basil insisted, his voice trembling. "The land was stolen from Arthur's family years ago, through deceit and bribery. I warned the council, but they turned a blind eye. Gerald's reply was sharp. "And you think coming back here and threatening the village will change anything? Arthur was a fool to believe he could rewrite history." The villagers watching seemed torn between support and skepticism. Miss Marple noted the faces carefully. Each bore its own story, its own reason to protect or condemn. Craddock intervened. "Enough. We need facts, not accusations. Miss Marple, did you find anything inside?" She handed him the letter. "This suggests a motive beyond personal grievance. Something involving old wrongs that may have led to murder." The inspector studied the document, then glanced at Basil and Gerald. "We'll be looking into the council records. Meanwhile, I want statements from everyone who was near the schoolhouse in the past week." Miss Marple lingered, watching the villagers disperse. The pieces were falling into place, but there was still something elusive, an undercurrent she had not yet caught. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft voice behind her. "Miss Marple." She turned to see Penelope Grey standing hesitantly at the gate. Her eyes were wide, nervous. I heard about the break-in," Penelope said. "I wanted to come by, but I wasn't sure if I should." "You're quite right." "To come," Miss Marple replied kindly. "This place holds the key to much of what is hidden." Penelope swallowed. "There's something I must tell you, about Arthur, and about that night he returned." Miss Marple listened intently as Penelope revealed that Arthur had confided in her a secret just before the garden party. He had discovered proof of a long-forgotten betrayal tied to the schoolhouse, a betrayal that implicated some of the village's most respected families. "He was frightened," Penelope said softly. "Not of death, but of being silenced. He begged me to help him, but I was too afraid. I didn't want to get involved." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "Fear often leads to silence, but silence can be more dangerous than words." As the afternoon waned, Miss Marple made her way back to the village centre, her mind weaving the threads of the day's revelations. The map, the letter, the break-in, they all pointed to a scandal that stretched back decades. Yet the urgency with which the culprit had acted suggested that some among the villagers were still desperate to keep the past buried. At the village pub, where whispers of the day's events filled the smoky air, Miss Marple observed the subtle glances exchanged. Gerald Huxley spoke quietly to a group near the fireplace, while Basil Reed sat alone, nursing a drink. Penelope Grey remained conspicuously absent. Miss Marple's eyes caught the figure of Mrs. Sims behind the bar. The landlady's sharp gaze met hers briefly. She seemed to hold a quiet knowledge, as if accustomed to hearing things not meant for all ears. Later, as the evening shadows lengthened, Miss Marple returned home to consider her next steps. There was a letter resting on her doorstep, its handwriting unfamiliar. Breaking the seal, she read a brief note. "Truth is a dangerous thing in Netherdean. Some are willing to kill to keep it hidden. Be careful who you trust. A friend." Miss Marple folded the note with a steady hand. The game was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. The morning mist still clung to the hedgerows when Miss Marple set out for another walk through Netherdean, this time with a renewed sense of urgency. The anonymous note weighed heavily on her mind, a stark reminder that the shadows around the Bridgman mystery were darker and perhaps more dangerous than anyone yet imagined. The village, usually so tranquil, felt as though it were holding its breath, waiting for the next secret to surface. Her first stop was the village hall, where the council's old minutes and documents were kept in a dusty archive. Miss Marple had arranged to meet the clerk, a meticulous man named Mr. Havisham, who had worked in Netherdean for decades and possessed a memory as sharp as his spectacles. As she entered the small room lined with filing cabinets and overflowing bookshelves, Mr. Havisham greeted her with a nod. "Miss Marple, I understand you have an interest in some of the council's older records," he said, adjusting his glasses. "Yes, thank you for accommodating me. It seems the Bridgman family's troubles with the council go deeper than anyone here remembers." Mr. Havisham led her to a large oak table and began pulling out leather-bound volumes. As the two sifted through the documents, Miss Marple's eyes caught a series of entries concerning a disputed parcel of land adjacent to the schoolhouse. The dates spanned nearly 30 years back, and one name recurred with unsettling frequency: Leonard Huxley, the same family name as Gerald Huxley. He was a councillor at the time, Mr. Havisham explained, known for his aggressive approach to local development. There were whispers of underhanded dealings, but nothing was ever proven. Miss Marple nodded, quietly piecing together the implications. If the Huxleys had benefited from the loss of the Bridgman land, that would explain Gerald's defensive attitude, and perhaps the urgency behind Arthur's return. As she turned, a folded newspaper clipping slipped out. The headline read, "Village Scandal Rocks Netherdean. Council Member Resigns Amid Corruption Allegations." The accompanying article detailed how Leonard Huxley had abruptly resigned amid accusations, but had never been formally charged. The scandal had faded into obscurity, buried by time and the silence of those involved. "Do you still have the files from the investigation?" Miss Marple asked, eyes bright with interest. Mr. Havisham hesitated. "Some records were lost or destroyed, I'm afraid. But I do have correspondence that might shed light. You'll find that the council was eager to close the matter quickly." The sense of a cover-up grew stronger. As Miss Marple collected the papers, she felt the weight of history pressing down on the village, long-buried resentments, unspoken grudges and secrets locked away in paper and memory. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sudden arrival of Inspector Craddock, who looked as weary as ever, but with a glint of purpose in his eyes. "Miss Marple, I've just come from the coroner's report," he announced. "There's something you should know." Together, they walked to the nearby cafe, a modest establishment favoured by the villagers. Over steaming cups of tea, Craddock laid out the findings. "Arthur Bridgman didn't die from a single blow, as we initially thought," he said. The cause of death was strangulation, but with a distinct ligature mark suggesting a narrow cord or wire. No signs of a struggle at the scene, which suggests he knew his attacker. Miss Marple's lips pressed into a thin line. The gentle orchard setting had concealed a brutal act, one committed with calculated cruelty. "Did the coroner find anything else?" she inquired softly. "Yes. There was a faint trace of a rare plant residue on the body, something like foxglove. It's not conclusive, but it suggests the attacker may have had knowledge of local flora." That detail piqued Miss Marple's curiosity. The village gardeners, the herbalists, even those who tended the school's overgrown grounds, all possible suspects now. Before they could delve further, the cafe door opened to reveal Penelope Gray. Her expression was anxious, eyes flicking between the two. "Miss Marple, Inspector, I need to speak with you," she said hurriedly. "Something happened last night." The trio left the cafe immediately, following Penelope's lead to a narrow lane behind the village church. There, near the ancient yew tree, lay a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. Penelope hesitated, but then handed the parcel to Miss Marple. Inside was a worn diary, its cover cracked with age. Miss Marple recognized the handwriting instantly. It belonged to Eleanor Bridgman. She kept this hidden all these years, Penelope whispered. I found it in the attic of her old house when I was helping clear it out. I thought it might explain why Arthur was so determined to return. Carefully opening the diary, Miss Marple began to read aloud, the voice calm but edged with emotion. They think I am a foolish old woman, but I see the threads others do not. The land was stolen, yes, but there is more. Leonard Huxley has enemies beyond the council, men who fear what he knows. I must protect my family, even if it means silence. Arthur must be careful. Trust no one. The entry was dated just weeks before Eleanor's sudden death years ago. Miss Marple closed the diary gently. This confirms that Arthur's suspicions were shared by his mother. There was a threat greater than just a land dispute. Penelope shivered. Do you think Eleanor was murdered too? It is possible, Miss Marple said, her eyes distant. And someone has been watching over this secret for decades, willing to silence those who speak. Inspector Craddock nodded grimly. We need to interview Leonard Huxley's family, especially Gerald. If this danger lingers, we must find out who stands to gain from keeping it hidden. As they made their way back toward the village, the fog seemed to deepen, wrapping Nether Dean in a veil of mystery. Miss Marple felt the familiar pull of a puzzle that demanded patience, keen observation, and a steady hand. The threads were tangled, the stakes higher than she had first imagined. And somewhere in the quiet village, the shadow of the past waited to reveal its deadly secret. The afternoon sun struggled through the thick canopy of clouds as Miss Marple and Inspector Craddock made their way down the winding lane toward the Huxley estate. The ancient oaks lining the path whispered secrets in the gentle breeze, their shadows stretching long and thin across the gravel. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and fading roses, a bittersweet reminder of summer's retreat. It was the kind of day that seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to break the silence. The Huxley house stood imposing and austere at the end of the lane, its stone facade weathered but proud. Gerald Huxley awaited them in the drawing room, his expression taut and guarded. The older man's sharp eyes betrayed a mind accustomed to scrutiny, yet there was a flicker of unease beneath his composed exterior. Inspector Craddock, he said with a curt nod. Miss Marple. To what do I owe this unexpected visit? Miss Marple returned his greeting with quiet grace. Mr. Huxley, we have some questions about your family's history, particularly regarding your father, Leonard, and the dispute surrounding the Bridgeman land. Gerald's jaw tightened. Those matters were settled long ago, though I admit the circumstances were regrettable. The Bridgemans have always been difficult neighbors. And yet, Mr. Bridgeman was found dead under suspicious circumstances. Shortly after returning to the village, Craddock interjected gently. We're trying to understand if any lingering resentment might have played a part. Gerald's eyes flickered briefly with something. Was it guilt? Fear? Before he masked it with a practiced calm. I am sorry for Mr. Bridgeman's passing, but I assure you, my family bears no ill will. I was unaware of his return until recently. Miss Marple observed him keenly, noting the subtle tension in his hands as they clasped a silver cigarette case. And the note found at the scene, did it resemble any handwriting you recognize, or perhaps messages Mr. Bridgeman received in recent days? Gerald's face paled imperceptibly. I cannot say. Arthur was a private man. We had little contact in recent years. Before the conversation could deepen, a sharp knock at the door interrupted them. The maid entered carrying a small, wrapped parcel with trembling hands. Mr. Huxley, this was left at the front gate just moments ago. No note. Gerald took the parcel, unwrapped it carefully, and his eyes widened as he unfolded the contents. A faded photograph of a younger Leonard Huxley, standing beside an unidentified man in the village square. On the back was scrawled, "Remember the past, or be doomed to repeat it." The room fell into a heavy silence. Miss Marple's fingers traced the edges of the photograph thoughtfully. "It seems someone wishes to remind you, Mr. Huxley, that history is never truly forgotten." After leaving the Huxley estate, Miss Marple and Craddock walked slowly through the village. The mood was thick with unspoken tension, as if the air itself held its breath. At the cafe, a small group had gathered, whispering fervently as the news of the note and photograph spread like wildfire. Among the crowd, Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the furtive glance of a woman in a faded blue shawl, Mrs. Edith Marsh, a long-time resident known for her keen gossip and sharp tongue. Miss Marple approached her gently. "Mrs. Marsh, I wonder if you might help me. Have you noticed anything unusual in the village recently? Any strangers, odd meetings, or changes in behavior?" Edith's eyes darted nervously. "Well, Miss Marple, you know this village is usually quiet, but there's been talk about someone lurking near the old mill at night. Folks say it's one of the Huxley boys, though I can't say for certain." "The old mill," Miss Marple repeated, the wheels in her mind turning. "I recall it was once a place of business for Leonard Huxley before it fell into disuse. Perhaps there's more to that location than meets the eye." Later that evening, Miss Marple decided to investigate the old mill herself. The path leading to it was tangled with brambles, the wooden door sagging on its hinges and the windows clouded with grime. As she stepped inside, the air smelled of dust and forgotten memories. In the dim light, she spotted a scattering of papers and a small glass vial containing a dried pressed flower, foxglove perhaps. The residue of the plant mentioned in the coroner's report. A scrap of torn fabric caught her eye, clutched between the floorboards, its deep green hue familiar. Suddenly footsteps echoed outside. Miss Marple's heart quickened, but she kept her composure. Drawing back into the shadows, she watched as a figure approached, young and tall, with the hesitant gait of someone unused to skulking in darkness. It was Thomas Huxley, Gerald's younger son, whose reputation for rebellion was well known. "Thomas," she called softly, stepping forward. He jumped but quickly masked his surprise with a forced smile. "Miss Marple, what an unexpected pleasure. What brings you here?" "I could ask you the same," she said mildly, her eyes narrowing. "I found evidence that someone has been using the mill recently. Foxglove residue, torn fabric." "Care to explain?" Thomas's face flushed. "I was just clearing out some old things. I wanted to find out more about the family history. My father keeps everything locked away." Miss Marple studied him carefully. "And the mill is a convenient place to hide secrets?" Thomas hesitated, then sighed. "Maybe, but I swear I had nothing to do with Arthur Bridgman's death. Just wanted to understand my father better." His desperation seemed genuine, but Miss Marple knew better than to take appearances at face value. "Thank you for your honesty, Thomas. If you discover anything unusual, I hope you'll come to me." As he left, Miss Marple felt the puzzle, pieces shifting again. The Huxley family's past was a tangled web of pride, resentment and fear, and not everyone in Netherdean was willing to let it unravel. Returning home, Miss Marple found Penelope Grey waiting on her doorstep, clutching another piece of the puzzle, a letter she had discovered hidden within Eleanor Bridgman's diary. It was unsigned, but the handwriting was unmistakable. "Miss Marple," Penelope said breathlessly, "this letter speaks of a meeting between Leonard Huxley and an unknown visitor, discussing matters best kept from prying eyes. It's dated a fortnight before Eleanor's death." Miss Marple read the letter carefully. The visitor's identity was deliberately obscured, but the tone hinted at threats and blackmail. It was clear that Eleanor had been entangled in a dangerous game, one that may have cost her life. That night, as the village slept, Miss Marple sat by her window, the letter and diary spread before her. The threads were pulling tighter. The Bridgeman tragedy was not an isolated event, but a chapter in a long story of secrets, lies, and power. And somewhere, hidden in the quiet streets and hedgerows of Netherdean, the true danger still lurked, waiting to strike again. The morning mist hung low over Netherdean as Miss Marple and Inspector Craddock convened at the village hall, a modest brick building that served as the centre of local affairs. The previous evening's discoveries had rippled through the village, stirring unease and sparking whispers in every corner. News travelled swiftly in such a close-knit community, and everyone was eager, if apprehensive, to see where the investigation would lead next. Inside the hall, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. The familiar faces of villagers filled the room. Farmers, shopkeepers, and housewives all gathered under one roof, some out of curiosity, others out of a growing sense of dread. Among them, Miss Marple noted the subtle exchanges of glances and the nervous shifting of weight, signs of the many unspoken tensions beneath the surface. Craddock took the floor first, clearing his throat as he addressed the assembly. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice. As you know, the death of Arthur Bridgeman has shocked us all. Our investigation continues, and we appreciate your cooperation. We ask that anyone with information, no matter how insignificant it may, come forward." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Miss Marple's eyes scanned the room, settling briefly on Gerald Huxley, whose posture seemed stiff, his face unreadable, and then on Thomas Huxley, who avoided meeting anyone's gaze. Edith Marsh was seated near the back, her lips pressed into a thin line, eyes darting nervously. After Craddock's remarks, the floor opened to questions and comments. Several villagers voiced their suspicions and theories, their voices a mixture of fear and frustration. "I heard tell that Mr. Bridgeman was involved in some unsavory dealings before he left the village," an elderly man declared, his voice gruff. "Maybe those past sins caught up with him," another woman added. "There's talk that the Huxleys have been scheming to buy up land around here for years. Perhaps Arthur opposed them, and someone wanted him out of the way." Miss Marple listened quietly, recognizing the familiar pattern of half-truths and assumptions that often clouded the truth. The villagers' perceptions were colored by old grudges and hearsay, but the detective in her knew that beneath these surface tensions lay more intricate motives. As the meeting dispersed, Miss Marple caught up with Penelope Grey, who was standing near the doorway looking pale and unsettled. "Penelope, have you noticed anything new? Anything that might have slipped past our attention?" Penelope hesitated, then nodded. "I spoke with Mrs. Marsh after the meeting." She was reluctant, but eventually she confided that she overheard a heated argument at the village inn 2 nights ago, just before Arthur's death. Miss Marple's interest piqued. "An argument, you say? Between whom?" Mrs. Marsh wasn't certain, but she thought she heard the voice of Gerald Huxley, and a woman's voice, raised and angry. She said the words, "You will regret this," echoed through the room. Miss Marple's mind raced, piecing together the significance. If Gerald had been involved in a confrontation, it might explain the threatening photograph and the note found at his estate. But who was the woman, and what was the cause of their dispute? Later that afternoon, Miss Marple visited the village, in herself, a cosy establishment with low beams and a roaring fire that did little to warm the chill in the air. The innkeeper, Mr. Samuels, greeted her with cautious politeness. "Miss Marple," he said, wiping a glass, "I heard you're looking into poor Arthur's death. Strange times indeed." "I understand there was a disturbance here a few nights ago," Miss Marple began gently. "Might you recall who was involved?" Mr. Samuels furrowed his brow. "Aye, there was a bit of a row. Gerald Huxley and a woman came in late one evening. They were heated, voices rising. The other patrons kept quiet, not wanting to get involved." "You know who the woman was?" The innkeeper hesitated. "No, but I recall she was well dressed, not one of the usual villagers. I heard mention of her being from London." A visitor from London, Miss Marple mused. That might be significant. As she left the inn, Miss Marple reflected on the new information. The presence of an outsider added a new dimension to the mystery. Someone who might have motives beyond the village's petty squabbles. That evening, Penelope Grey arrived at Miss Marple's home, clutching a small bundle of papers. "I found these among Eleanor Bridgman's things," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Letters between Eleanor and an anonymous correspondent. They speak of secrets too dangerous to reveal." Miss Marple unfolded one of the letters, reading the carefully penned words. The writer hinted at a scandal that could ruin reputations and even threaten lives. There were references to debts, betrayals, and a plan to set things right, but the author remained deliberately vague. "It seems Eleanor was caught in a web far more tangled than we realized," Miss Marple said softly. "These letters suggest she was trying to expose something or someone." The following day, Miss Marple arranged a discreet meeting with Gerald Huxley at her own home. The man arrived looking worn, the weight of recent events etched deep into his features. "Understand your concerns, Mr. Huxley," she began gently. "The past has a way of catching up with us. I want to offer you a chance to speak frankly, without fear of judgment." Gerald hesitated, then sighed. "Very well, Miss Marple. There are things I have kept hidden, hoping to protect my family. But perhaps it is time to bring them into the light." He spoke of Leonard Huxley's dealings with unsavory characters in London, debts incurred, and promises broken. Of the mysterious visitor mentioned in the letters, a woman named Catherine, who had once been close to Leonard, but whose relationship ended bitterly. Gerald believed that Catherine's return to Netherdean had stirred old resentments and dangerous ambitions. Miss Marple listened, her mind assembling the pieces. The arrival of Catherine, the dispute at the inn, the threatening photograph, all threads of a larger tapestry of secrets and lies. As dusk settled over the village, Miss Marple felt the familiar stirrings of anticipation. The investigation was reaching a crucial stage, and the true nature of the danger shadowing Netherdean was beginning to emerge from the mist. The game was far from over, and the next moves would be critical in unmasking the stranger everyone remembered and the darkness they had brought with them. As the days lengthened into early spring, the village of Netherdean remained wrapped in a delicate hush, a quiet waiting that felt almost like the breath before a storm. The death of Arthur Bridgman had settled over the community like a shadow, and with it came a creeping suspicion that beneath the village's gentle facade lurked truths too uncomfortable to confront openly. Miss Marple spent much of her time in her cosy sitting room, poring over the notes she had gathered, re-examining the fragments of conversations, the nuances of behavior, and the faintest glimmers of contradiction in the statements she had heard. She had always believed that the essence of detection lay not in grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but in the small, overlooked details, the way a hand trembled, a gaze flickered, or a phrase was chosen with care. The revelation from Gerald Huxley regarding Catherine's involvement had opened a new chapter. Miss Marple found herself intrigued by the mystery of this visitor from London, who appeared to have disturbed a delicate balance and reignited old wounds. Yet who was Catherine truly, and what had driven her back to Netherdean? Was she merely a messenger of past grievances, or something more sinister? One afternoon, Miss Marple found herself walking the quiet lanes that led to the old Huxley estate. The sprawling grounds were still marked by the harsh winter, but the soft green of emerging shoots promised renewal. Gerald had invited her to speak further with his sister, Margaret, who was said to know much of the family's history and secrets. Margaret Huxley received Miss Marple in the drawing-room of the estate, her demeanour calm yet guarded. "You are very thorough, Miss Marple," she remarked, pouring tea with practised grace. "I understand the weight of your inquiries. The past is a delicate thing here, sometimes best left untouched. I am only trying to understand what led to such a tragedy, Miss Marple replied gently. If there are truths that must be told, they can no longer remain hidden. Margaret hesitated, then began to speak in a low voice. She recounted tales of Leonard Huxley's struggles, financial woes, failed ventures in London, and a web of complicated relationships, including the one with Catherine. She was more than just a friend, Margaret said carefully. They had plans that went beyond business. When Leonard's fortunes fell, their partnership dissolved bitterly. Catherine left, but she never truly left us. The detective's eyes narrowed. Do you think her return had something to do with Arthur Bridgman's death? Margaret gave a subtle nod. Arthur was trying to keep peace, to protect what remained of the family. But Catherine, she wanted justice of her own, or revenge. Miss Marple thanked her and left the estate with a growing sense of unease. The layers of betrayal and grievance were more intricate than she had imagined. That evening, a letter arrived for Miss Marple, delivered discreetly by a village postman. The handwriting was unfamiliar, careful, almost hesitant. Inside was a brief note. Meet me at the old chapel at dusk. I have something you must see. See, curiosity and caution mingled within Miss Marple. The old chapel, long disused, stood on the outskirts of the village, a place associated with forgotten rites and silent memories. She resolved to go, though she could not predict what awaited her there. As dusk settled and the sky deepened to twilight, Miss Marple approached the chapel's weathered stone doorway. The air was cool and still, the silence profound. Inside, a solitary figure waited, a woman tall and composed, her face partially shadowed, but unmistakably the Catherine spoken of in whispers. I trust you received my letter, Catherine, said, her voice soft but resolute. I did, Miss Marple replied. You asked to see me. What is it that you wish to share? Catherine stepped forward, her eyes reflecting a mixture of sorrow and determination. I have lived with the consequences of past choices. Leonard Huxley's death was a turning point, but Arthur's was something else, something darker. I have evidence that implicates more than one person. There are lies within the village that have festered like wounds. Miss Marple gestured to a small satchel Catherine carried. May I see? From the bag, Catherine produced a bundle of letters, photographs, and a leather-bound journal. She explained that these were kept hidden for years, fearing they might bring ruin or even danger. But with Arthur's death, silence was no longer an option. Together they examined the materials by the chapel's dim light. The letters revealed a series of covert dealings, threats, payments, and secret meetings involving prominent villagers, including names that Miss Marple had come to regard as pillars of the community. The photographs showed clandestine encounters, and the journal contained candid entries detailing Leonard's increasing desperation and Arthur's attempts to intervene. One entry caught Miss Marple's eye. A mention of a final warning given to Arthur days before his death, followed by a promise that no one will stop the reckoning. The words chilled her, confirming that the murder was no impulsive act, but a calculated move in a larger scheme. As the evening deepened, Catherine confided a personal truth. I came back because I wanted to make amends, but I feared I might become a target as well. There is someone here who will go to any lengths to keep these secrets buried. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Thank you for trusting me. This changes much. It seems the stranger you spoke of was not just an outsider, but a catalyst, a mirror, reflecting the village's hidden darkness. They parted that night with a newfound resolve. Miss Marple knew the days ahead would test her skills and patience. The delicate web of deceit was tightening, and the truth, as always, was cloaked in layers of human frailty and fear. Back in her own home, Miss Marple sat by the fire, turning over the revelations in her mind. The clues were aligning, and the identities of those involved were becoming clearer. Yet she remained cautious. In Nether-Dean, as in all places, appearances were deceiving, and the heart of the mystery was still concealed behind carefully crafted masks. As she prepared for what would come next, Miss Marple was reminded that in every village, the stranger is not always the one who arrives from outside, but sometimes the one who lives within, hidden in plain sight, waiting to be revealed. Miss Marple's days settled into a quiet rhythm of careful observation and delicate inquiries, though beneath the surface of the village's usual tranquility, the currents of tension ran ever stronger. The weight of Catherine's revelations lingered in her mind like a shadow she could neither dismiss nor fully grasp, and she found herself increasingly attuned to the subtle shifts in the village's behavior. The morning after her meeting at the chapel, Miss Marple decided to revisit the village square. She moved with her usual gentle pace, stopping to exchange pleasantries with familiar faces while watching for any flicker of unease or avoidance. The whispers were no longer discreet. They fluttered openly now, like restless birds disturbed from a nest. At the bakery, Mrs. Bates, who had once been so cheerful, now cast wary glances around before lowering her voice. "They say Catherine's letters have stirred up a hornet's nest," she confided, handing Miss Marple a neatly wrapped loaf. "Some say Arthur's death was just the beginning." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, accepting the bread. "And what do you think, Mrs. Bates?" The older woman's eyes twinkled despite her worry. "Well, dear, I think the truth is like a weed in a garden. It may be hidden at first, but it always comes up, no matter how carefully you try to cover it." Encouraged by this, Miss Marple made her way toward the village hall, where she knew several villagers would gather to discuss the latest developments. The room was filled with hushed conversations and nervous laughter that could barely mask the anxiety beneath. She found herself drawn into a small group that included Reverend Smallwood, the vicar, Dr. Ellery, the village physician, and Mrs. Latham, the local schoolteacher. Each wore the mask of concern and civility, but Miss Marple detected subtle tensions in their interactions. "It is distressing, isn't it?" Reverend Smallwood began, folding his hands. "To think that such darkness should have been growing amongst us unnoticed." Dr. Ellery nodded, his brow furrowed. "And the suggestion that several villagers might have been involved in underhand dealings, if true, would shake the foundation of our community." Mrs. Latham glanced nervously at the others before speaking. "One can hardly imagine who would wish harm on Arthur Bridgman. He was a good man, devoted to the village." Miss Marple listened quietly, then ventured gently. "Goodness is often a fragile thing, Mrs. Latham, and sometimes the intentions behind actions can be far more complicated than they appear." The group fell silent, and the room seemed to contract with the weight of unspoken truths. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple received a call from Sergeant Fletcher. "Miss Marple, there's been a development you might find interesting," he said with a hint of urgency. "We've found something in Arthur's study, a hidden compartment in his desk containing letters and documents. Some seem to corroborate what Catherine mentioned." "I see," Miss Marple responded calmly. "Might I come to see them?" "Certainly. I'll arrange for you to visit with the inspector later today." Miss Marple's eyes glinted with quiet determination. "Exactly. But there is more. Something that others have overlooked. A detail small enough to be dismissed, yet significant enough to change how we see the whole." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle. Arthur was murdered not just because of debts or grudges, but because of a fear that certain truths would come to light, truths that threatened the social fabric and personal reputations. The question is, who feared those truths most? Mrs. Bates shifted uncomfortably, her fingers clutching her handbag. But who among us would go so far as to kill? We all knew Arthur in some way. Miss Marple's gaze softened but remained firm. Sometimes Fear and desperation can drive even the kindest hearts to acts they would never have imagined. Kai. Room grew heavy with silence. Reverend Smallwood broke it softly. Miss Marple, you mentioned a detail others missed. What might that be? Miss Marple glanced at each face before answering. At the scene of the crime, a single flower was found, one not native to this region, one that requires careful tending. It was a sign, a message, but not one that would be understood by many. Catherine's eyes widened. That flower, I saw it at the Bridgman estate, in the small greenhouse Arthur's late wife had tended. Penelope added, a rare orchid, if I'm not mistaken. Difficult to cultivate, expensive, and certainly a symbol of something precious and hidden. Precisely, Miss Marple said. It suggests that the killer wanted to leave a clue, a signature only someone close would recognize, or perhaps it was a mistake, an unguarded token. Gerald frowned. You think the murderer left the flower deliberately, as a warning or a confession? Miss Marple considered. It could be either, but more importantly, it links the crime to a person familiar with Arthur's private world. Someone who knew about the orchid, its meaning, and its place in his life. Reverend Smallwood shook his head slowly. But who would that be? We all knew Arthur, but who would dare to use such a personal symbol? Miss Marple's eyes rested on Mrs. Bates, who visibly stiffened. The answer may lie in those closest to Arthur, or those who envied what he represented. The conversation was interrupted by a sudden knock on the door. Sergeant Fletcher entered holding an envelope. Miss Marple, this was found at the village post office. It arrived this morning, addressed to you. Miss Marple took the envelope, noting the lack of a return address. Carefully opening it, she withdrew a single sheet of paper. Its message, typed but chilling. Stop digging or more will follow. A hush fell over the room. Miss Marple's face remained composed, but inside the stakes had risen. The killer was watching, warning her to halt, and yet she was more resolved than ever to see the truth revealed. She folded the note slowly. This is a challenge, she said softly. A reminder that secrets carry consequences. But fear will not deter me. Gerald looked uneasy. Perhaps we should reconsider our involvement. This is becoming dangerous. Catherine shook her head firmly. If we don't face this, who will? Arthur trusted us to find the truth. Miss Marple smiled gently. Courage, my dear, often appears in the smallest acts. This village may be full of secrets, but it is also full of people who want justice. As dusk settled outside, the group dispersed, each burdened with new fears and uncertainties. Miss Marple remained, her mind already weaving the threads of what she had learned, what had been revealed, and what still lay hidden. The puzzle was nearly complete, yet the final pieces required patience and subtlety. With a calm heart and keen eye, Miss Marple prepared for the confrontation that would bring the truth into the light, revealing not only the murderer, but the tangled human nature that had made this crime possible. As the soft glow of evening settled over Nether Dean, Miss Marple gathered the key figures once more in her drawing-room. The air was thick with unspoken tension, every face etched with a mixture of apprehension and weary hope. The quiet village, so accustomed to gentle rhythms and familiar faces, now held its breath for the truth to emerge from shadows long cast. Miss Marple began with the calm that had carried her through so many mysteries. Thank you all for coming. Again. I believe the time has come to lay bare what has been hidden beneath polite smiles and carefully kept secrets. She paused, letting her gaze sweep the room. Gerald Huxley's stern composure, Reverend Smallwood's nervous clutching of his collar, Catherine Whitaker's determined posture, Penelope Gray's wary attentiveness, and Mrs. Bates's hesitant presence. The key to Arthur Bridgman's death lies not in a sudden act of passion or reckless greed, but in a carefully calculated fear. Fear of exposure, of losing everything that gave some of you comfort and standing in this village. Miss Marple reached for the orchid, now pressed and framed behind glass, a silent witness to the story. This flower, so rare and delicate, was much more than a plant. It was a symbol of control, a reminder of a past promise, and a message meant for one particular person, her eyes fixed on Gerald. You, Mr. Huxley, knew of Arthur's affair with your late wife, an affair you hid carefully behind your public facade. You feared that Arthur's knowledge might shatter your reputation and destroy the life you had rebuilt. Gerald's jaw tightened, but Miss Marple pressed on. On the night of the murder, you confronted Arthur in his greenhouse. The argument escalated, and in desperation, you struck him with the nearby orchid pot. The flower was left as an unconscious signature of your guilt. But why the threats, Miss Marple? Reverend Smallwood asked quietly. Because fear breeds caution. Mr. Huxley hoped to intimidate me into silence, believing I might expose him, but I had already pieced the puzzle together through observation and listening to the villagers' whispers. Catherine looked away, tears welling. It's so tragic. So many lives affected by secrets that should have been spoken of long ago. Miss Marple nodded gently. Indeed, this village will heal, but the lesson remains. Truth, though sometimes painful, is the only path to peace. As the villagers absorbed the revelation, Miss Marple allowed herself a rare moment of satisfaction, not in the solving of the crime alone, but in the restoration of justice tempered with compassion. The peaceful village of Netherdina would never be quite the same, but perhaps now it could begin anew, freed from the burdens of its silent past. Miss Marple's eyes glinted with quiet determination. Exactly, but there is more. Something that others have overlooked, a detail small enough to be dismissed, yet significant enough to change how we see the whole. She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle. Arthur was murdered not just because of debts or grudges, but because of a fear that certain truths would come to light, truths that threatened the social fabric and personal reputations. The question is, who feared those truths most? Mrs. Bates shifted uncomfortably, her fingers clutching her handbag. But who among us would go so far as to kill? We all knew Arthur in some way. Miss Marple's gaze softened but remained firm. Sometimes fear and desperation can drive even the kindest hearts to acts they would never have imagined. Room grew heavy with silence. Reverend Smallwood broke it softly. Miss Marple, you mentioned a detail others missed. What might that be? Miss Marple glanced at each face before answering. At the scene of the crime, a single flower was found, one not native to this region, one that requires careful tending. It was a sign, a message, but not one that would be understood by many. Catherine's eyes widened. That flower, I saw it at the Bridgman estate, in the small greenhouse Arthur's late wife had tended. Penelope added, a rare orchid, if I'm not mistaken. Difficult to cultivate, expensive, and certainly a symbol of something precious and hidden. Precisely, Miss Marple said. It suggests that the killer wanted to leave a clue, a signature only someone close would recognize, or perhaps it was a mistake, an unguarded token. Gerald frowned. You think the murderer left the flower deliberately, as a warning or a confession? Miss Marple considered. It could be either, but more importantly, it links the crime to a person familiar with Arthur's private world. Someone who knew about the orchid, its meaning, and its place in his life. Reverend Smallwood shook his head slowly. But who would that be? We all knew Arthur, but who would dare to use such a personal symbol? Miss Marple's eyes rested on Mrs. Bates, who visibly stiffened. The answer may lie in those closest to Arthur, or those who envied what he represented. The conversation was interrupted by a sudden knock on the door. Sergeant Fletcher entered holding an envelope. "Miss Marple, this was found at the village post office. It arrived this morning, addressed to you." Miss Marple took the envelope, noting the lack of a return address. Carefully opening it, she withdrew a single sheet of paper. Its message, typed but chilling: "Stop digging or more will follow." A hush fell over the room. Miss Marple's face remained composed, but inside the stakes had risen. The killer was watching, warning her to halt, and yet she was more resolved than ever to see the truth revealed. She folded the note slowly. "This is a challenge," she said softly. "A reminder that secrets carry consequences. But fear will not deter me." Gerald looked uneasy. "Perhaps we should reconsider our involvement. This is becoming dangerous." Catherine shook her head firmly. "If we don't face this, who will? Arthur trusted us to find the truth." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Courage, my dear, often appears in the smallest acts. This village may be full of secrets, but it is also full of people who want justice." As dusk settled outside, the group dispersed, each burdened with new fears and uncertainties. Miss Marple remained, her mind already weaving the threads of what she had learned, what had been revealed, and what still lay hidden. The puzzle was nearly complete, yet the final pieces required patience and subtlety. With a calm heart and keen eye, Miss Marple prepared for the confrontation that would bring the truth into the light, revealing not only the murderer, but the tangled human nature that had made this crime possible. As the soft glow of evening settled over Netherdean, Miss Marple gathered the key figures once more in her drawing room. The air was thick with unspoken tension, every face etched with a mixture of apprehension and weary hope. The quiet village, so accustomed to gentle rhythms and familiar faces, now held its breath for the truth to emerge from shadows long cast. Miss Marple began with the calm that had carried her through so many mysteries. "Thank you all for coming. Again. I believe the time has come to lay bare what has been hidden beneath polite smiles and carefully kept secrets." She paused, letting her gaze sweep the room. Gerald Huxley's stern composure, Reverend Smallwood's nervous clutching of his collar, Catherine Whitaker's determined posture, Penelope Gray's wary attentiveness, and Mrs. Bates's hesitant presence. The key to Arthur Bridgman's death lies not in a sudden act of passion or reckless greed, but in a carefully calculated fear. Fear of exposure, of losing everything that gave some of you comfort and standing in this village. Miss Marple reached for the orchid, now pressed and framed behind glass, a silent witness to the story. This flower, so rare and delicate, was much more than a plant. It was a symbol of control, a reminder of a past promise, and a message meant for one particular person, her eyes fixed on Gerald. "You, Mr. Huxley, knew of Arthur's affair with your late wife, an affair you hid carefully behind your public facade. You feared that Arthur's knowledge might shatter your reputation and destroy the life you had rebuilt." Gerald's jaw tightened, but Miss Marple pressed on. "On the night of the murder, you confronted Arthur in his greenhouse. The argument escalated, and in desperation, you struck him with the nearby orchid pot. The flower was left as an unconscious signature of your guilt." "But why the threats, Miss Marple?" Reverend Smallwood asked quietly. "Because fear breeds caution. Mr. Huxley hoped to intimidate me into silence, believing I might expose him, but I had already pieced the puzzle together through observation and listening to the village's whispers." Catherine looked away, tears welling. "It's so tragic. So many lives affected by secrets that should have been spoken of long ago." Miss Marple nodded gently. "Indeed, this village will heal, but the lesson remains. truth, though sometimes painful, is the only path to peace. As the villagers absorbed the revelation, Miss Marple allowed herself a rare moment of satisfaction, not in the solving of the crime alone, but in the restoration of justice tempered with compassion. The peaceful village of Netherdina would never be quite the same, but perhaps now it could begin anew, freed from the burdens of its silent past.